Do I support Russia? I support not having a team sport mentality when analyzing geopolitics. I support the working class people of Ukraine and Russia and all around the world as they are the ones who are losing their life for the interests of their governments. I support ending the war. And to be able to do so, you must understand why the war started in the first place, which is why I pointed out that last year Jens Stoltenberg openly admitted that the reason the war started in the first place was because of NATO expansion. If you do not believe me, listen to him yourself.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Like, people are honestly denying reality because they're drinking all of the fucking Western juice from Western media. It's so fucking pathetic. All you need to know is that what's going on in Ukraine is an American proxy war against Russia. NATO don't want to stop expanding because NATO is controlled by the United States and the United States is controlled by APAC. Hassan is no Marxist or communist by any sense, but he is correct about this. The war in Ukraine did not start in 2022 like Western media leads you to believe. It started in 2014. 2022 was a further escalation of an ongoing conflict. Jens Stoltenberg himself admitted last year that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was because of NATO. As I mentioned, in 2014, the American-backed far-right neo-Nazi coalition led to the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in Ukraine, which started this war. On the topic of China, even the fucking Americans have a one China policy. The only people who don't believe that China and Taiwan is one nation are the neoconservatives who works for the military-industrial complex in the United States. If you don't want to listen to me, look, Anthony Blinken last year said the US one China policy has not changed. How many times do Western media have to lie to you to make you realize they aren't really fucking telling the truth? It is all just propaganda. Ukraine just launched long-range missiles into Russia. Do you know what that means? That means this is the closest we have ever been to a nuclear war in Europe. I'm glad you said that, because Europeans do have this black and white mentality. I pointed out how Ukraine had a neo-Nazi coup in 2014. It was a US far-right led revolution where they overthrew a democratically elected leader in Ukraine. Have you heard that before? Have you heard that before? Calling someone a Putin shill or a Putin apologist or Putin propagandist, it's being done to silence you, because they aren't saying you are wrong. They aren't saying they disagree. They're saying it's propaganda. They're saying it's a lie without even having to engage with the evidence on how you formed your opinion in the first place, because their opinion is based on abstractions, what they've heard from other people. I randomly found this video yesterday. Ukrainian soldiers fighting with Russia against Ukraine. I'm pointing it out because you have to be some type of special motherfucker to think that the world is black and white. On one side, the Russian working class people are being killed by an oligarch in Putin. On the other side, Ukrainian working class people are being killed because of the United States and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Before I end the video, I want to say two things. First of all, when has the United States ever been on the right side of history? Where? When? So if your side is being supported by the United States, you should definitely just question your alliances. And the last thing I want to say is that we are truly having a black and white conversation, not only because it's my side, your side, you know, I am me and you are the other, which I demonize, but it's also this purity thing. You know, my opinion is pure, and if I were to listen to you and engage with your conversation or your point of view, I would be dirtying my pure opinion, which is why they are so fixated on calling this opinion propaganda. You know, Putin is the other, is the evil, the barbarian other, and we are the pure Europeans. Someone left a comment on my page speaking about how the global left should unite itself to be able to liberate Africa. That's not happening, and I'm going to speak up from the perspective of living in Norway. I live in Norway. Jeg bor i Norge, ikke sant? In Norway, you have socialists and communists who openly support NATO and believe that NATO should exist. NATO is an anti-communist imperialistic organization which was created to further American capitalist interests in Europe. If you were to engage in revolutionary struggle in Europe, NATO would be there to destroy it. If you were to mobilize the people to take over the state so that the state would work in the interest of people instead of the interest of corporations and capital and profit, NATO would be there to destroy you. Do you know who Thomas Sankara is? Leftists in Europe love Thomas Sankara. But do you know why they love Thomas Sankara? Because he died. He got killed. That's why they love him. Because they do not have the same energy for Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, like, I can't even start to mention how influential he has been on the African continent. When speaking about non-Africans who have supported the African struggle, there is no other name that can be spoken of louder than Fidel Castro. These people don't actually care about the African struggle. They support what Thomas Sankara represents. Someone who died for their cause. For his cause, I'm sorry. They paint him in the same way they paint Jesus. He was a savior and he got killed by the enemy. I just want to make myself clear that my critique is again on NATO support. I live in Norway, so I speak from the perspective of Norwegian socialists and communists, but I want to paint a broader picture. People who support NATO are European imperialists and they are no friend of African liberation. They don't even care about the liberation of their own people against capitalism, as they support the most anti-communist, anti-socialist organization on this planet. Hello there, comrade. There seems to be a misunderstanding. You are a leftist. We have nothing in common. You think socialism is about being morally good and having values such as freedom and happiness. What the fuck are you talking about? Let me make myself very clear. NATO supporters are white supremacists. NATO is an anti-socialist and anti-communist organization. It is the formation and coalition of white supremacist Western imperialist nations. This is not an exaggeration. Are you reading? Are you reading? Or what? Socialism or being on the left has nothing to do with morality, has nothing to do with equality for all. That's not the case. Please grow out of this mentality. NATO member states are defenders of liberal democracy, of white supremacy. Supporting NATO is quite literally supporting white supremacy. How is this not clicking? All right, it is clicking. You just don't care. If you want to understand how the war in Ukraine started in the first place and want to understand how that is linked to what's currently going on in Georgia right now, stay for a bit and let me keep you updated. You see, in 2013 and 14, this is from 2014, Ukraine had some issues with their economy and they needed assistance. But there are two parties to get assistance from: the EU, NATO, and United States, or Russia. The reason I have this picture up is because this loan crisis, a loan from the EU or a loan from Russia, is what started everything. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Russia have had strong trade relationships. The Ukrainian economy relies on Russia and their markets and their cheap gas. If you have any understanding of the EU and NATO, you understand that once you are a part of those nations, you are basically under the control, or at least the influence, of the United States. So Ukraine had a choice to make, or at least Yanukovych had a choice to make: the United States or Russia. And Yanukovych made a deal. He chose to side with Russia, and it isn't because he's a Russian puppet or anything. We tend to talk about human beings as if they have agency. We are not the West. I am not the West. He chose Russia because they gave him the better deal for Ukrainian people in their current situation. But the United States, the EU didn't like that. NGOs from the United States had orchestrated a coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 using the far-right elements of the right sector and the Azov battalion in combination with like Svoboda, which is all right-wing ethno-nationalist groups who seek to do ethnic cleansing to the minorities in Ukraine. This NGO is the main instrument in American interest being spread across the world. They work like the CIA, because the CIA used to do this, but then they got exposed, and now they do it with NED and US aid. Oh yeah, let me not forget to mention, this is CIA, Radio Free Europe. That's CIA as well. Just look it up. You don't have to believe me. Just look this up. Here you have Victoria Nuland on the grounds in Ukraine, an American official, State Department official on the ground in Ukraine, giving food to protesters. The same Victoria Nuland who were caught talking about doing a coup d'etat in Ukraine with Payat, this dude right here. Oh yeah, the same Victoria Nuland, by the way, who is now on the board of director of National Endowment for Democracy. But let me get to the ending and let's talk about Georgia as well. Let's just say that the protest became more and more violent as more far-right elements were introduced into the protest, and they eventually succeeded. To any person who tries to tell you that the United States, EU and NATO did not support an Ukrainian far-right neo-Nazi coup in 2014 to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Ukraine in Yanukovych, ask them why the right sector refused to give up the government buildings they occupied even after the peace deal was signed by Yanukovych. Ask them why the right sector are so prominent that they are on stage with the opposition. This is one of the propaganda channels from the Ukrainian Revolution who are still funded by the European Commission, Germany and Sweden. Let me make a part 2 because I know y'all niggas aren't trying to watch all this. Now let's talk about Georgia and how it's linked to the 2014 Maidan revolution in Ukraine. Recently, Georgia decided to push their bid for joining the EU to 2028. And the government of Georgia saw what happened in Ukraine, and they did something earlier this year. They implemented what they call a foreign agent law. What that law does is require any NGOs that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad to officially register themselves as pursuing the interest of a foreign government. And if you remember from my previous video, I talked about how this NGO, the National Endowment for Democracy, is a creation and tool from the United States, which they use to train journalists and activists to possibly overthrow countries like they did in Ukraine. Which is why the Yankee state and the EU decided that this law was undemocratic. Like this tweet is depicting, how come the Georgians just have EU flags laying around? And more importantly, why do you have signs in English? You live in Georgia. For what? I live in Norway. For what reason would I make a sign in English if I live in Norway? Because these signs are not for the Georgian people. It's for you. It's for the Western world. Just like when Victoria Nuland was out there giving food, these NGOs are right here giving food to people, making sure that these people stay. And right now they have a started attack. And currently the protesters are creating mayhem, attacking government buildings. It's almost like we've seen that one before. And the NGOs are already giving out freshly new masks for the protesters. Like, be fucking for real. The government knows what the EU and the United States are trying to do in Georgia. The people know, but do you know? Someone talked about Ukrainian sovereignty in my comments and I almost couldn't stop laughing. Do we live on the same planet? Let me ask you a question. How is it that Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, can openly talk about how the United Kingdom, NATO and the US imperialist forces and allies are using Ukraine to do a proxy war against Russia, and it not being something which is spread on mainstream media?
We are, let's face it, we're waging a proxy war. We're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies.
Let me remind you what Boris Johnson did in Ukraine. When the invasion started, the war started, Zelensky said Ukraine will not join NATO. Every single party in this conflict understands that NATO expansion is the reason for this war. But Boris Johnson didn't like the fact that the Ukrainians and the Russians were actually talking about possibly ending the war. The peace deal that was interrupted by Boris Johnson would have given Russia less Ukrainian land than they currently occupy. So when we speak about Ukrainian sovereignty, the Ukrainian people have sovereignty, and the Ukrainian people are the ones who are losing their lives because of this NATO and expansion and Russia's response to NATO expansion. The Ukrainians are the ones losing their lives in addition with the Russians. Zelensky, on the other hand, has no sovereignty. He is a puppet for Western interests in Ukraine. He is a NATO puppet, which is why he continuously keep demanding that Ukraine enter NATO. Do you think that is only by his own volition? He's a fucking NATO puppet. And who is suffering from this? The Ukrainian people. Because for some reason, y'all niggas think I just love war and I love watching Ukrainians die. I do not. I just recognize the material conditions which created this situation in the first place. When you want to talk about sovereignty, though, you have to remember the person that feeds you controls you. You do what your mother and father says because they give you food and give you housing. The United States and NATO allies are the ones giving weapons to Ukraine, so they do. So Zelensky does what the United States wants him to do, which is why he hasn't been able to shoot these rockets without the permission from the United States. Because he is a puppet. You understand? I'm not saying these things out of nowhere. Because they give him weapons, they give him the means to defend Ukraine, he do what they say. When they said lower the drafting age to 25, he did it. He did it. Now they're saying lower the draft age to 18. Will he do it? Oh, he doesn't want to do that. We'll see what happens though.